I am very excited to introduce you to our speakers for this panel. Madeline Knightley is the Director of Guaranteed Income at the Economic Security Project and co-chair of the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice. Leslie Kaush has been a North Carolina licensed clinical mental health counselor since 1994. As part of her work, she tried to help people navigate an inadequate and punitive means-tested system of public and private assistance. Emily Squadra has been a professional baker and cook for over a decade and has allowed her passion for food to take her many places. After running a baking company during the pandemic and pivoting several times, she decided to exit the food industry and became a substitute teacher for PPS, Portland Public School System, I'm assuming, with goals of becoming a health teacher who teaches kids how to cook. And last but not least, Adam Bozeman from Steady will be joining us remotely. Adam is the co-founder of Steady, an organization that helps its members understand and increase their incomes through advanced financial analytics. After growing up with a single mother who worked nonstop to make ends meet and seeing the massive and growing income challenges in the US, Adam is proud, there he is, to lead the Steady team. During COVID, Steady developed some of the first automated private sector basic income pilots in multiple large urban metros, including Los Angeles and Austin. We're going to actually start by focusing on questions directed to Adam and Madeline, as we have Adam for half an hour. So, big picture first. The pandemic caused an unprecedented economic fallout that wrought significant pain to millions of Americans. Many are still struggling to recover from destabilization, but we know the majority of people have been struggling even before the pandemic. So first, let's focus on the problems or issues that workers are and have been facing that has impacted the significant shifts we're seeing in labor. Adam, your organization, Steady, works closely to support your members who are often part of the gig economy to help stabilize their income. Can you share with us what insight Steady has on what challenges your members are facing that the pandemic has exacerbated?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today. First off, we have about 5.5 million workers on the Steady platform today. Those workers consist almost universally of non-standard workers, those who are building income portfolios in order to make ends meet, consisting generally of hourly work, other forms of part-time work, contract work, various forms of 1099 work and gig platform work. I think we have a pretty unique lens into the financial lives of this workforce as a result of one of our primary focuses or features that we provide to our workers is helping them to understand their income. So as a result of that, they provide us with connectivity to their financial accounts, to their income accounts, their deposit accounts, in certain instances, their payroll accounts. And we help them to understand that data. And we also look to pull out insights from that data that can help to advance equity specifically for our worker community. So what have we seen, right, over the course of the last, really, I think pre-pandemic, leading into the pandemic, and now post-pandemic? Pre-pandemic, there was a massive underemployment challenge, right? We had workers on our platform, lots and lots of workers who were struggling to generate sufficient incomes and who were struggling to generate predictable incomes because of variable hours at their employers, their W-2 employers, variable hours that they could not control and didn't have enough notice of. 1099 workers who relied on utilization rates being high, but could not control those. And so they had a difficult time understanding and being able to predict income to ensure that their financial health was going to be at least adequate. Obviously, the pandemic struck. Nearly 30% of the workers on our platform received some form of unemployment benefits, right? We could see those in their accounts during the course of the pandemic. Those that were non-standard workers waited way too long to receive those unemployment benefits, 4 to 6 months on average. We mapped that by state. And so we've worked really hard now in terms of taking our data to try to advance the equity and the benefits ecosystem specifically for the non-standard workforce. But as we've come out of it now, right, what we've seen is a couple of things. One is an exacerbation of underemployment, with workers going back to work, in many instances with less hours, less utilization than they had pre-pandemic. And then now what we're seeing is really a massive shift towards non-standard work. And that non-standard work comes with a tremendous amount of challenges, specifically 1099 work, right? It comes with a tremendous amount of challenges, lack of worker protections, lack of any form of a safety net in most instances. But we've seen workers who have increased their income through 1099 work. We ran a study for the state of Louisiana, for the Workforce Commission, who was getting a tremendous amount of pressure from their legislatures, who were being lobbied by employers saying, why can't you find me workers? They're not coming back to work. So we conducted an analysis. And what we found is that, it was 95, 96% of the workers who had been on unemployment benefits in Louisiana that we had visibility into had returned to work. There was a 70% increase in those that went back to 1099 work. What we saw was an increase in incomes from 1099 work versus the income that they had generated from their W-2 work. Clearly, again, I could certainly address this if chosen later. 1099 work has a ton of challenges that I think workers clearly need to understand. But our message back to the Louisiana Workforce Commission is, what's the response to those employers who are lobbying that they can't get workers? Pay them more, right? And I think we're seeing that universally now throughout a workforce nationwide.
Thank you. I hope you can hear the applause too. So Adam talked considerably about the fact that there were many 1099 and other such non-regular workers even before the pandemic, but that became quite exacerbated during. Madeline, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, from on a more broad basis, what has been happening in the labor space, and why has the Great Resignation kind of shifted and now seems more like a Great Reshuffling, that we've changed the phrasing a little?
Yeah, thank you. Am I on? Now? Am I on? Sounds like it's on. Okay. I just need to take a moment and acknowledge what happened this morning at the Supreme Court and the fact that the rollback of rights of people who can bear children are very much under attack, and that we cannot have economic justice without reproductive justice. So I know there are a lot of people in this room that are personally impacted by what's happened, and all of us are impacted by what will happen in our communities and in our economy when we make it harder for people who can have children to have autonomy over their bodies, to be able to engage and work. And I just need all of us to take a moment and acknowledge what is happening to all of us in our community right now. All right, so I'm going to rage cry through this. And I welcome all of you to join me, because now is a moment to feel all of our feelings, and then we have to go back out there and fight to make this world what it needs to be for all of us. All right, so what's happening in labor? No pun intended. Yeah, right. People are done, as Adam said, pay workers better. Make it safe. During the pandemic, which we are still in, right? So let's not call this post-pandemic, let's call it late pandemic. And let's hope it's late pandemic. The most marginalized communities were our frontline workers. They were the people who were in jobs that required them to be in proximity with others, that increased their risk of illness for themselves and their families, and they pay shit wages. I'm sorry, I've got no filter today anymore. It is gone. Yep, no worries. We are done, right? We are done And so what are we seeing? We're seeing people stand up and fight back. We are seeing people say that I am not willing to do this, to take this risk on myself and on my family. I demand more. And what we saw actually was a governmental response that supported families. This was the first time that stimulus checks went out to $0 earners. Now, there were a lot of flaws in how it went out that trace back to kind of how we exclude people throughout our tax system. So when we use the tax system to send payments out, they don't reach a lot of the most marginalized folks. But there was no earning requirement to get the stimulus checks. There was no earning requirement to get the child tax credit. This is the first time this has happened. We sent $1 trillion out. And that small economic cushion, I think, allowed folks an opportunity to breathe for a moment, to look around and to say, I am not putting up with this. I'm going to work with my colleagues at my Starbucks store, at my Amazon warehouse, at my Trader Joe's. At my Apple store, and we're going to unionize because we know the best way to support ourselves and our community is through unionization efforts. So with high union density, all wages are raised. So I think that we're seeing an opportunity come out of desperation. And I forget what the rest of the question was.
So, I mean, you kind of already addressed it, but that are we seeing a shift from what we were first calling the Great Resignation, where a lot of people are just leaving the labor market altogether, to now more people kind of taking the moment to reassess where in the labor market they want to?
Yeah, I think definitely we are seeing that it was not a resignation, it was a reshuffling. It was folks trying to find better fits that allowed them to be home with their kids during remote school, that allowed them to, be in positions that don't require that forward-facing role that would impact their health and the health of their loved ones. And we saw people just trying to claw up the economic ladder. I mean, we see how precarious it is all the time. And in a global pandemic, when you can't find pasta and you can't find toilet paper, you know that 30 cents more an hour might make the difference between feeding your kids and not. And so scrambling and clawing for what little security and safety you can find, I think makes a lot of sense.
Right. Thank you for that. I think this is a question for both of you, Adam and Madeline. You both talk about number one, the increasing precarity of work and the labor force right now, and how there were very specific strategies, study in particular, kind of jumping in and trying to fill a gap, and then the policies that you talked about as one-time or at least temporary measures. How, in your minds, does this moment then lead to kind of a more sustained effort to, bring basic income into kind of the policy imaginings, both for your membership and then kind of more broadly? And Adam, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, I appreciate that. So for us, what really convinced me that this needed to be a core focus of our business, which we never anticipated it would, was when we ran an emergency cash grant program for gig workers in 1999, pre-pandemic, with our NGO partner, the Workers Lab. And we ran a program for about $500,000 that went out, no questions asked, to gig workers who we saw had some form of financial shock, which we identified as either a meaningful loss of income or a very large expense where we could see that their financial health was impacted by things like missed housing payments, missed auto loan payments, missed utility payments. What we saw as a result of small dollar contributions to those workers, which were $500 in that first instance, were those that received the funds outperformed in earned income those individuals that had similar shock but didn't receive the funds by an average of 46% over the following 6 months, right? We supported that with qualitative data, and we had conversations with each of those individuals. And what we heard repeatedly was, in a absence of a safety net, right? The only thing I could focus on, to Madeline's point, was how do I put food on the table for my kids at the end of the week? How do I make sure that the rent check payment is made? And as a result of that, all of the decisions have to be short term. They have to be, how do I earn $50 today? How do I earn $75 tomorrow? Not how do I have a cushion in place or a safety net that will enable me to go try to find a job that's going to provide me with some better level of stability than what I'm in right now. So we carried that forward post-pandemic or during the pandemic into our emergency cash grant program, worked with the Workers Lab that scaled, and then very actively became involved in the basic income community. And I think for us, it's all about the data, right? And it's all about the data at scale. So what we're very excited about in terms of our support of MGI and the guaranteed income community in general is unifying data in a way where that data has scale and can be used to create proof points where there's no discussion. The data is the data and the facts are the facts. So for us, what that is each of the pilots that we're undertaking, which I think right now amount to 25 to 30 and growing, is each of the individuals where we're distributing funds on behalf of the administrators of the programs. We are taking the actual impact data, right? The deposit data, the financial data that we can see in the accounts. And we are aggregating that data, obviously on a non-PII basis, and providing that data to the partners at Center for Guaranteed Income Research at UPenn and Stanford Basic Income Lab, so that they can look at and hopefully create policy papers around not just, here's one pilot with 100 people that folks who, may be, completely against this movement can look at and poke holes in. But this took place across the entire country. There were thousands or tens of thousands of workers. This ran for a year or years. Here are the results. These are not debatable, right? So our what we're very excited about is helping to provide those that have the voice, specifically those that have the ears of policymakers, with the tools, specifically the data that they need to be successful in those conversations.
Thanks, Adam. And also, thank you for bringing studies insight into this discussion. And thanks for your time. I know that you are going to need to leave fairly soon. So we really appreciate that you made some time for us. Madeline, can you expand on a little bit what Adam talked about with respect to the role of basic income?
Yeah, I think that the pandemic response, the fiscal response from the federal government gave us data. For many Americans, we received guaranteed income during the pandemic in the form of stimulus payments and the child tax credit, which reached up very high into high-income earners. So for families with children, that functioned as a guaranteed income. And what we saw was not only did poverty levels fall in 2020 as our economy cratered in a global pandemic, the poverty fell, but also racial disparity fell, and particularly the child tax credit not only lifted all families with children up, but had a really big change on disparities. So under the way that the child tax credit has worked in the past, you have to have a certain income threshold to receive the full credit amount, which meant that 50% of Black kids in this country did not live in a family that would get the full credit. So we changed that. We know what happens when you give people money. Food insecurity reduces. Kids are fed. Racial disparities in those really huge crises in our country around housing security and food security are reduced. And then we stopped doing it. And kids fell back into poverty. And people got hungry again. So one of the things that, again, we posit is that this cash transfer during the pandemic has had an impact on what we're seeing currently in the labor market with increased unionization and increased demands. And so we're exploring that. We've hosted a couple of convenings to bring folks together to talk about it and think about it, and to start having a conversation between guaranteed income advocates and labor advocates who don't always see each other as the same fight. I think historically there have been some folks that see guaranteed income as letting employers off the hook. That this is a way, we've all heard the stories about how many of Walmart workers receive public benefits, right? Because Walmart pays below living wages. A lot of folks pay below living wages. So I don't see these as in contrast. I think that a guaranteed income raises the floor on which the bargaining table sits, and it puts pressure on employers to pay more. Why would so Magnolia Mothers Trust, which is in Jackson, Mississippi, and provides Black moms living in subsidized housing with $1,000 a month. The average income for those moms is $11,000 a year. So let's think about a guaranteed income that raised everyone to the federal poverty limit, let's say $12,500. Why would I work a job as a CNA, work a job taking care of your elderly parent for low wages when I could be home providing food for my kids, taking them to their after school activities, right? You have to make this job worthwhile. And I think that the jobs that our country is needing are caregiving jobs, they're childcare and adult care. And those jobs have been performed by Black and brown women, and they've been undervalued since the start of this country. We are going to need to make these good jobs, or people will not do them. These can be good jobs. It is enriching to be in a caregiving position. Many of us choose to do that in our personal lives, right? But we have to make it worthwhile. We have to make these good jobs. And I think a guaranteed income is one way of building these into good jobs.
Thanks so much. So I want to turn a little bit to the kind of what this all looks like on the ground. So clearly there are opportunities for direct cash programs and policies, most importantly guaranteed income and UBI, to really change the relationship between individuals and the labor market, and to allow for much more, potentially more flexibility around making choices at that individual level. In a Pew Research Center poll conducted earlier this year, workers polled who had quit their jobs during the pandemic cited three main reasons for having done so. The top one was that low pay, no surprise. And the second was that there were no opportunities for advancement. And the third was that they felt disrespected at work. So Leslie, let's start with you. As a psychologist, what are the mental health impacts workers faced during the early days of the pandemic? And what might help us understand the decisions and the kind of processes by which individuals left their jobs?
Right. Well, I think what happened is over the last period, there's been a slow eroding of worker rights and work environments to, I think people almost didn't notice, or they would notice enough to go home and say, this thing happened, but they stayed. What the pandemic did is it ratcheted it up fast enough that people could kind of shake out of it and go, whoa, this is crap. Like, I'm not paid anything. I'm getting spit on at work. I'm having to work extra shifts with no protection. Like, this is trash. Like, it was a big enough shift that people could notice the difference. And there's this story that this was about work-life balance, that people moved so that they could prioritize their families. They prioritized the people who didn't have care otherwise, so they had to quit, or they had to, like, literally make sure you weren't endangering grandma. So the shifts were fundamentally about, just what you said, the research thing. people finally noticed the degree to which workers are disposable and completely unimportant, both as human beings, but also as workers. And because schools closed and older folks were at such risk, it didn't matter what your feelings were or what your desires were. Somebody had to take care of the kids. Somebody had to protect my mom. So I think it put stark contrast around what actually needed to happen, but also how disposable and unimportant. And something shifted so people didn't quite internalize, well, I'm in this crappy job because probably I'm kind of crappy and not good for anything else. I think it shifted people's consciousness that, like, we're in a pandemic and these folks don't care whether I or anyone in my household lives or dies. I'm out.
So it's the suddenness also.
Yeah.
So Emily, I am hoping you could give some flesh to this conversation. I know that you made some big decisions in your own life during this time that in some ways reflects the research, but in some ways is unique. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure, certainly. So I was a small food business owner at the very beginning of the pandemic. I owned a baking company called Wildflower Baking. And we were in 2 farmers markets in Portland, North Portland. And in March of 2020, we were actually talking to loan officers about getting a brick and mortar and sort of like growing our business a little bit. And needless to say, that didn't happen. And we ended up scaling back out of the farmers markets just due to the uncertainty. And at the time, it was only my business partner and I, really. And then my business partner ended up leaving at the end of May of 2020, suddenly. And I was sort of left with this business and these choices to make, and very unknown circumstances. I think one of the overwhelming feelings of that time was just like scrambling to do anything you could to like get people excited about your food, what you're offering. And we sort of had like a niche market of doing sourdough whole grain pastries focused on using direct farm produce. So trying to get people excited about that in the middle of a pandemic, trying to get them out of their houses, it was really hard. It was like this moral dilemma of like, do I want to encourage people to come out? Is it safe for me? Is it safe for them? And you know, the summer is the most profitable time for food businesses. And so at the end of July, and early August, I sort of realized, after switching kitchens, after hiring an employee, after you know, making adjustments to the menu, realized it wasn't going to work. And I think it was one of the best decisions I've ever made, where I sort of got to put myself first, rather than constantly catering to people and what they need. And I actually pivoted to an online baking school through Patreon. So I had like a whole Patreon set up, and there was this whole sourdough craze happening. So I kind of like got on the coattails of that. And through the winter of 2020, it was great. But I was still only making about $750 a month through my Patreon. So I was supplementing that income with the gig economy, doing Instacart, walking dogs. And you guys talk a lot about the 1099 employees, but I would also argue there's the whole Venmo section that is never even counted. Cleaning houses. So trying to just piecemeal these things together, it was incredibly unstable and incredibly, I had no idea what I was doing. You know, I had a Patreon baking company, school. So I sort of, again, in my own best interest, wanted to find something more stable. I also want to make a really important note, just in like full economic transparency, that I have the privilege of like having a safety net with my family, and that I have never felt that safety net more than during that time. It wasn't really something I thought about much, but then it was something I thought about a lot. And I couldn't imagine not having that and having other responsibilities on top of that, like having children and just that mindset of like, how can I make $50 tomorrow? How, like he was talking about. So that being said, I tried, so the summer of 2021, restaurants were sort of opening back up. And people were like, had this wave of optimism that summer is like the pandemic's gonna be over and we're gonna be bustling restaurants again. And they were looking for cooks and they were paying more than I had ever seen a cook get paid. $17 an hour plus tips was like insane at the time. So I took a job at a restaurant called Hey Love for about 2.5 months until they laid me off in August, right before a planned vacation. And I couldn't collect unemployment because I hadn't been there long enough. I was just so disillusioned with the food movement at that time. I had worked mostly in like farm to table sort of environment. And, you know, it's like the whole, it's always going to be better, like just around the corner. That was the attitude that had been going on in restaurants during the pandemic for about a year, and it wasn't getting better. And I really enjoyed teaching, something I learned through my Patreon baking school. And there was a shortage of substitute teachers, and they pretty much, all you needed was like a high school degree, I think, to become an emergency substitute teacher for Portland Public Schools. So I jumped on that. And while it was an emergency position, there was zero urgency behind the application process. And it took me about 3 months to finally get hired. And during that time, again, was a privilege to not be freaking out about where am I getting my money from. And so again, I had cleaning clients, I had dog walking clients, I was doing Instacart and Rover again. But again, those are all very unpredictable streams of income. And I finally, in December of 2021, I had my first few days as a substitute teacher in a middle school near my house, and it was chaos. But it was like this kind of chaos that involved meeting people where they are and being creative and all these tools that I had sort of gathered from working in the food service industry for 10 years. And I enjoyed it, and I still enjoy it, although it's very challenging. But I actually had an opportunity to take over the rest of the year for a health teacher who was teaching a cooking class at this school. So I didn't really know. They were like, our health teacher's leaving, can you take over for the next 12 weeks? And I was like, sure, sounds good. All they knew was like, I knew how to cook, and I didn't really know much else about it, but I had 120 kids, 6 induction burners and some pans, and I taught them how to cook eggs and make fried rice and some basic stuff, but it was really fun, and it was like a bright spot at this school during a really hard, dark year, and it just felt like this passion for food that I had was being applied in a different, more constructive way. And I was making twice as much money as I had ever made in my entire career. So
I'm wondering if actually for Leslie and Emily, both of you, if you could speak to, first of all, I mean, like, what a journey.
Yeah.
So kudos. But I really appreciate how you point out that you in effect did have a safety net, and that was key to really allowing you to take risks that perhaps you might not have mean, I'm not sure,
Yeah.
but, and so I guess my question is, and also for the individuals you're talking about, what difference, number one, did the stimulus payments make, if you know, specifically, and then secondly, specifically for those kinds of journeys where individuals are able to pivot, what role does basic income have in that specific regard?
Emily, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think like we live in a capitalist society, and there's like zero denying that. So when you give people money, you're giving them power, you're giving them options, you're giving them freedom, you're giving them peace of mind. So I would say like it provides all of those things, and it's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. Like $1,000 a month can make you feel so much more in control of your own life. So,
I think I agree with everything that you said. And a basic income says somebody gives a crap whether you live or die. And it does not take, Conrad talked about this actually yesterday, like it doesn't take much, and it actually doesn't take long for people to shift like, oh, I matter enough for somebody for it to be $300 a month or $500 a month. Like I matter enough for them to make that level of commitment. Like, well, okay, I can't be complete trash. Like I must have something of a brain. But truly, actually, you gain IQ points. You literally gain measurable IQ points when you take that precarity off. And so you can think more strategically, you can think more imaginatively, but you do it from a perspective of, what might I get up to, instead of crap, how am I going to make enough for us to eat tomorrow? Yeah. Which is a very different mindset.
Got it. So all three of you actually talk a lot about this notion of people caring, of feeling respected, and I'm wondering whether, in effect, you're talking about basic income providing some level of dignity for individuals, both in order to make that decision of I know work-life balance is not at the top, but there seems to be a little bit of that going on, but also the relationship that individuals as workers have with their employers. Do you see evidence of that in terms of this kind of intentional respect or improvement of respect? Because that does seem to be one of the top reasons why people leave. So in your both kind of at the macro level and micro, are you seeing actual improvements in respect as a result of kind of individuals having made different choices and that level of agency that enters into work choices?
I don't have a ton of data. I do believe that both the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration and Magnolia Mothers Trust have self-reported data on how, having your inherent dignity visualized through a guaranteed income has an impact, but I don't have any other data on that.
I mean, from personal experience, I think when you're able to, feed yourself and clothe yourself and have time for yourself, you gain more self-respect, and that gets projected as like people respect you more. So I think, there's a sort of self-feedback loop that exists there, and basic human dignity is important.
I said one thing.
Yeah.
There was also a skinny minute, especially with the child tax credit, where parents in particular had a notion for a minute that government could work, and it could work for actual normal people, not just the politicians. Of course, we trashed that. But if we could do this on a larger scale, it might actually help the feedback loop of the faith that citizens have of the government and the expectations we have of politicians. Like that was just an interesting shift that I hadn't counted on, regardless of people's politics. They were like,
A renewed
something
trust.
worked here.
Yeah, renewed trust in government. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. I think the civic engagement piece of guaranteed income, which was on one of the boards, is something to really explore and think about. And I was in a conversation on our Cash as Care panel, and two of the folks speaking, one is in the Old Fourth Ward and is part of the task force that built a guaranteed income program, and one was a guaranteed income recipient. Both of them talked about the feeling in the neighborhood when the stimulus checks or child tax credit checks come in. And like, yeah, your neighbors are friendly. People are out of their house, right?
Yeah.
Like people are on the street, and it creates space for civic engagement and community building because of that weight off your shoulders. And I do think that the feedback loop of government can and should work for the people. And here is an example. And so then we trust in government and we continue to demand more of government is really important.
And as somebody who really appreciates nature metaphors, I think that it's akin to like watering a plant. You can't like water a plant one time and be like, okay, you're good to go. Like you're gonna be great. And then like walk away because the plant's gonna die in like a month. So like that continual renewal of like funds is, I think, the missing piece, because there have been, these one-time stimulus checks that happen and everybody's happy for a couple weeks, but then it's like you're into the same spot in a month or so.
One other thing is that this has happened consistently in pilots. When people have a basic income and like their head is above water, they can breathe. And what happens is then they look around, they're like, oh, how can I make the neighborhood better? How can I make the community better? Like, oh, and politics. I mean, so see, this is my like secret UBI top secret thing. Don't tell anybody. UBI advocacy is my climate change initiative. Because if we can lift people out of poverty, the capacity that will be unleashed for people to develop an opinion and make it their business to make the world better, like this looks like my best shot at climate change, at ending climate change or making some difference in this around that issue, is if we can unleash capacity where people aren't figuring out where the $50 tomorrow is going to come from, they naturally, in pilot after pilot, start taking a bigger view and feeling sort of empowered and up to making some difference there.
I want to come back to these points. I have one more question, but I also want to kind of signal we do want to open it up to questions from the audience and as well as in live stream. So if you have a question, go up to the mic. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and ask one last question. So I love the metaphor of watering the plants. And Madeline, you had said early on about some of the kind of labor organizing that seems to have come out of the Great Reshuffling, perhaps connected to the direct cash grants. And then, of course, Leslie, your notion of you give people a floor and they can then think beyond that. I guess my question is in terms of next steps, to the extent that we do actually want to live in a world where the relationship between workers and employers is different and mutually respectful, and the kind of exploitation or disrespect that we see in so many sectors, that is something that we start pushing back on. Besides just waiting for it to organically happen, what are some things that we can do moving forward? And is basic income, of course, part of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of folks who are organizing in the labor space in really empowering and important ways, while there have been decades of attacks on labor and on workers. I do see guaranteed income as playing a role in that. And so, as I said, I've been partnering with Community Change around the Guaranteed Income and Worker Power Project, bringing folks together to explore this idea, hopefully seeding some research both in, looking at the last few years and figuring out, okay, well, what are the impacts really? Because I have an idea, and, we're seeing an idea take shape in the media. There was a moment of like lazy workers, and that's why you don't have your latte. And then, things are kind of happening. So I think we need to engage and shape the narrative that's being created. And I think a federal guaranteed income, if it is sufficiently robust, does make it a lot harder for wage exploitation. If you can get your basic needs met without relying on an exploitative job, then why would you do that, right? Like, it forces better employment. It shifts the balance of power between workers and employers in our economy and in our society. I do also think that means that makes it a much bigger fight. Like, it is one thing to give $300 a month per child, which is like not enough to cover my kid goes through paper and markers like she's kidding. I don't know, like, right? So it doesn't actually cover like raising a child, but it's something. But like a sufficiently robust guaranteed income is very dangerous to our current economy. It upends it, right? So that means that it's a much harder fight than just crumbs. But we don't want just crumbs.
Whether you want to.
I would say fighting for higher wages is like so important. I was doing a little bit of research on sort of the highest paying jobs with an undergraduate degree, and you can be a petroleum engineer and make $137,000 a year, while as a teacher with a master's degree, you make $45,000 a year, entry level. And so holding those things into stark contrast, it just shows you what our society cares about. And fighting for teachers to get paid better is not only an incentive for people to enter the profession, but it's also just like a basic respect of these people who are educating the future. And so fighting for wages, fighting for budgets to be raised, like for school budgets to be raised, but making sure that money goes into the salaries of teachers, not the pockets of the administration, those sort of things, fighting for more money for people is, I think, what it comes down to. Whether it's from the government, which it can also be kind of scary because in like 4 years, you don't know if it gets pulled, then what happens? So all the solutions have questions behind them. So, yeah.
And I think of it sort of two-pronged. I mean, we had that awesome panel talking about narratives and stories. And I think, and I know we've had gotten to see some really excellent ways to start getting a stronger narrative and in more different spaces so people can start to see what this would matter to people. But also, one of the things that I've been trying to think about, I live in North Carolina, we're fairly purple, and I live in a mixed Trump neighborhood. And so trying to figure out how to reach those folks, literally I had a neighbor, a strong Trump supporter. I ran into him just on the sidewalk and he said, "Were your ears burning?" And I got really nervous. That means, if you're don't know Southern, that means like we were talking about you and did you notice? Because apparently your ears are supposed to burn. And I said, no. And he said, well, me and the guys were sitting around the campfire out back and we were debating what's the strongest argument for a basic income. I was like, they weren't arguing was a basic income. So I asked, I'm like, so who thought it was about? No, we were all like, what's the strongest argument? And I was like, cool. You can give them my number if you want. Like, this just happened because I shoot my mouth off and say things and they pat me on the head and laugh a little and I go, hi, and then I say it next time.
Those seeds are being planted.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, let's take some questions. So come up to the mic, tell us who you are, where you're from, and if the question is for a specific person, who that's for. But otherwise, if it's for everyone, you could say that too.
Sid Frankel. I come from a country where women still have the right to control their bodies. And I think we'd welcome women from the US who wish to enter that country. I have a question for all of you. So during the pandemic, we saw great support, or at least not much palpable opposition to the state taking a major role in supporting the basic needs of the population in Canada and the US, throughout Western Europe. So I'm wondering, is this a major shift in how people are thinking about the role of the state? Or does the state just have this role during emergencies? Or is there a shift in what the role of the state is seen more generally, even in situations which are not emergent? Thanks.
So I know that there was some research done by Catherine Thomas at Stanford looking at support specifically of UBI. And it did find this like bump up from white women who got us Trump, got us this court, but it didn't last, right? And so unfortunately, I know it's kind of an easy thing, but I think that racism rears its ugly head again, right? So for a minute, there was a we're all in it together. And by that, we mean white people who aren't supposed to be in economic distress are. And so that allows us the space to say government should act. And then the stabilizing factor of intergenerational wealth and access to higher incomes means that, and when research started coming out of who was impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, like all of it shifted. So much like we saw in the documentary last night, where the mother's pension provided support, and then when that was opened up and there was an idea that welfare would be supporting Black women, we clawed it back. Similarly, I think that there was a moment of folks who aren't normally in this situation are, so we demand government intervention. Oh no, wait, it's going to benefit those people and we have to cut it off. So I think that there are, I know that there are groups, I'm sorry, my coat is on the mic, that are really trying to capture that and hold on to that to build trust and faith in government. And I think, you know, Heather McGee's work around the Sum of Us and a lot of Demos and other folks are doing really important work to challenge this, but we keep running up against the same fight.
I have someone who's almost a friend, who's a Trump supporter, who's a basic income supporter too. We are cordial to each other, so it can happen.
Safe space.
It can happen.
Safe space, Michael.
It can happen. Here's my question though. It's about the disrespect issue and all that stuff. Most people in the U.S. who are lucky enough to have secure jobs, steady jobs, they work in spaces that are basically autocratic regimes. Employers can fire them. They can't fire the employer. Employers decide how much they're paid. They don't decide how much the employer is paid. I mean, they basically are just autocrats, right? I mean, it's not democracy at all. And their only hope is that they get a benevolent dictator that they work for. That's about it. So I'm wondering if, like a lot of people talk about basic income and guaranteed income and its effect on the labor market. The focus is on wages, which makes sense, and flexibility. But do you think there's a place for basic income or guaranteed income to play in trying to democratize workplaces? Because people may still want to work, but they may want to have more democratic rights in their workplaces. Can BI and GI play a role in that? That's the question.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the things that a union can provide, right? And I think that there are other ways in which power shifts. I think that's a really interesting thing to explore more fully. And I am thinking about folks that work on, you know, like coworker and so forth that are really thinking about worker ownership. And there isn't, to my knowledge, a robust conversation yet, but this is adding to my to-do list, but in a good way.
I mean, I think the other way that shifts power is if you don't have to go to your crappy job so that you get the $50 next week, if you have just enough of a floor, you have more space to walk away or look around or come up and say, dude, this is not working. Like, how about we do this instead? And if they say no, cool. It just gives you more freedom to make those choices without off the cliff.
Yeah, I mean, I would say going from being somebody who's worked mostly for small food businesses, which, you know, the owner is often the last person who gets paid in that situation, to a larger, like, unionized workforce as a teacher. I'm still figuring all of that out and what it feels like. But I have also thought a lot about what it would look like for food workers to unionize on like a small business level, what that would look like for them, and also as a small food business owner, what that would look like for a small food business owner. Because if labor prices go up, which they should, and all the other costs are going up, what is that going to look like for small food business? Will there be like small handcrafted artisan food? Because there's almost zero incentive to be there. But again, I'm just kind of flipping my perspective in different ways. So yeah, it's interesting to see how that would affect very small food businesses, I guess.
I'm going to use my moderator privilege to jump in and ask a question, and then I promise I'll come back to the questions that are out there. As you talk about the impact of guaranteed income or basic income in empowering workers, not only in the kind of non-regular paycheck workforce, but in the regular workforce as well, it occurs to me, nevertheless, that the Great Reshuffling that we're all reading about is happening not just in the lowest wage workforce, but in higher kind of rungs as well. And in fact, there's a huge outflux of unionized teachers from the teaching profession.
Yeah.
So, you know, it pushes back a little bit on this notion of basic income being the fuel for this great reshuffling. And, you know, frankly, in kind of standard, you know, more lucrative workplaces, we're also seeing, maybe not to the same extent, but we are also seeing a lot of leaving. So I guess I'm just wondering whether we're really still then talking about basic income supporting that, or whether there's something else going on, or whether even a basic income that comes nothing close to the wages that those workers are making is still having an impact. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I would say a lot of people are just very unsatisfied with their jobs from just a fulfilling standpoint. There's a reason I never entered a like profession where you sit at a computer and type for most of the day. I don't think I could handle it. And I know a lot of people who did that and are unsatisfied with their job, even though they're making six figures and are trying to figure out how to do something more creative. So I think that like creativity needs to be part of the solution. Also, there needs to be like the whole work-life balance thing. We need to have jobs that have meaning behind them, that aren't just. I honestly I don't know what these people are doing at their jobs. Like, I don't know what they're doing. So, but it doesn't seem meaningful, I guess. So I think the meaningfulness is what's behind it. There's all these people who are looking at their lives, sitting in their work from home office, and are like, why am I doing this? I want to be like part of the solution. I want to help people. And so yeah, that's a much larger question of, you know, how do you inject meaning into these jobs rather than just money too.
I have a lot of complicated feelings on it. I mean, work won't love you back, right? Like, should I find meaning in my job, or should I just like do my job and get a paycheck and find meaning in the rest of my life?
Yeah.
I don't know. And I think
question.
we struggle with that. So I hear you, like jobs need to be meaningful, or hear me out, they need to like not wreck our bodies and not take up too much time and help us pay for things. I think about teachers, a guaranteed income is not a silver bullet. So thinking about teachers, kids are getting shot in the classroom. Parents are screaming in their faces about what they can and can't teach. They are not allowed to protect their trans and queer students. Like how the teachers I know are devastated at what's happening to our school system right now. So, I mean, the outflux of teachers makes a lot of sense. It also, y'all, it is a global pandemic, right? Like these teachers, one time when they were starting to do hybrid school, my kids' class, like this whole school shut down for some cases back when they still did that. Now they're just like, put a mask on, they'll be fine. And my kid was on with her teacher. She's in the ICT classroom. So there's two teachers. A lot of the kids, it's integrative co-teaching, right? So a lot of the kids have disabilities in the classroom. So it's a mix of kids with disabilities and kids without disabilities. That's what the ICT is. So she's got two teachers. I could see one of the teachers had multiple screens up, was talking in Zoom. These kids are 7 and 8 years old, talking to different Zoom groups. The other teacher, her toddler is literally crawling across her head while she talks to my kids' group. And I'm like, oh my God, do you want me to do something while you do this? She's like, this is easier than we have when we have half of them in the class and half of them at home and we're trying. She's like, this is no problem. I'm like, no, your kid's like eating your eyes, right? Like, what is happening? So yeah, man, like that is really hard. And a guaranteed income, no matter how robust, is not going to make that easier. So I think there is a lot that we need to do to create supportive systems and environments for workers and people in this country.
Right. I mean, I didn't invent this perspective, but a basic income isn't going to solve every problem, but it makes a lot of problems easier to solve. And what I'm seeing sort of anecdotally from friends and clients in more sort of teaching or white collar jobs is that, like, you know, the teachers that I know have whiplash from being heroes and now can't be trusted to figure out what books to read in the classroom. And plus the hybrid thing. And a lot of folks who are on the computer all day, like they get screenshotted, but also the camera like every minute or every 2 minutes. And they better be looking at their computer and not at their, you know, and so what a basic income would do is it would just give them more choices. Either start your own business on the side and see if you can grow it. It would give you it would be easier for you to take those risks, or go find something else. Like you don't have to have something that like you don't take a week off in between just so you can cover things. It would give you a chance to breathe and think.
Got it. Let's take another question from the audience.
Hello, my name is Sarah Fay, and I'm a grassroots basic income advocate from Vancouver, Washington here. And so when I was going through my journey of trying to live in alignment with my own values, I found it was a difficult thing to work jobs that were high paying without selling my dignity. And the jobs that did align with my values didn't pay. And if they did, they underpaid me. And it was like, for this to exist, you have to exploit me. I'm not okay with that, right? And so, you know, to live in alignment, I would almost have to work for myself, right? But I have learning curves to how to do that, right? So I need that space and time to learn how to do that. So I don't have to work for somebody that makes me feel icky, you know? And so my question to whoever wants to answer it is, how do you see this helping people live more in alignment?
It's a big one.
I mean, I would say it gives people more options. You don't have to take, like, you know, when you're filling out your unemployment, you are required to look for jobs. You are required to accept any job that is given to you. Whereas if if that was not the case, and you could actually kind of shop around for jobs where you felt the work culture like matched up with where you want to be, that would be great. And yeah, I would say just options.
By the way, I just want to say, you mentioning the Venmo and Patreon and stuff, like I had to do a lot of that myself because that was the only way I was able to get funding for some of the stuff that I was doing. And it's hard to do that because like you also have to find the perfect wording for people to support you. And,
Right.
and that takes talent too. And it's like, am I doing enough, you know?
Yeah, and you have to sell yourself.
Yeah. And
which is also hard and feels icky.
Yeah, and money provides that safety net for yourself. You know, you can meet those needs, but like if people aren't paying you enough, it feels like you don't deserve to be safe. And so I think just that anybody who showed up here today, thank you, and anyone listening, because I think together we can maybe shift the different skill sets that have been created during these jobs that were out of alignment. We can now get those people together to make a better culture, to make a change. And I think that's what we're doing here today. So thank you, everybody.
I sort of think of work on a continuum, like sort of to your point, like these are fulfilling jobs that I think are important and do things in the world and, or, you know, whatever. And then there's jobs like, I do it because it funds the cool things that I do in my life. But I think what the pandemic did is it showed that there's actually a huge whatever the percentage is, a mess load of jobs down here that are actually terrible for the world, terrible for us, but it's how we're going to put food on the table. And we don't have any bandwidth to look for either of these. And what a basic income would do would shift the whole curve more to this side of the equation.
I also wonder whether, and this is kind of a question for the economists in the room, you know, Emily, you had juxtaposed earlier the salary of the petroleum engineer and the teacher, and the extent to which if you actually get money in the pockets of more people so that wealth and income isn't concentrated, whether as consumers, right? And this, I think, speaks to the alignment of values. It's a much more democratized consumption pattern so that people are spending according to their values, which then, I'm just musing, I'm not an economist, but whether that then also to some extent equalizes the playing field in terms of what jobs pay. Just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, if the cost of living wasn't so high, I think that would be true. But like the fact that we have to, you know, pay so much just to have four walls to protect us, like, you know, rent is so expensive, insurance is incredibly expensive. I don't have a large passion for insurance, but a lot of my income goes to it. So like if there was more, I think that like that democratization, like, and people think that way, right? Like you think like, you know, spend with your values or whatever, but like the, you know, $5 you spend at a coffee shop every week isn't going to really shift the world. Like, and this is coming from, I was, you know, very value-driven baking company, and it didn't pan out for me.
Take another question.
Hi, so this question is actually from our virtual audience. This is from Dennis Bayami. I hope I'm saying your last name right, Dennis, and he's from Winnipeg. And their question is there evidence that there is a greater appetite for basic income by the general public and politicians since the pandemic? And if so, how do we capitalize on that?
Yeah, so the research I talked about found a bump, but I think it was mostly lost. It wasn't sustained. I think that there has been recent polling on child tax credit. So this is something that the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice is going to be exploring in our next several meetings around the politics of guaranteed income. What is the temperature in the room, what is polling, and then also how do we use the thermostat? How do we move folks with polling and messaging, right? So I think it's UBI Center has a pretty robust collection of the polls to date on guaranteed income, but I'm happy to dig it up and send it around after this.
Hi, my name is Maya Calvin. I'm with a small nonprofit called Assist. And my question might be a little bit redundant, but basically the stuff you were talking about with more engagement in government and politics, if people are getting, money from the government, I mean, I definitely felt that myself, even with the stimulus checks. I was more interested in what the government was doing and how I could maybe participate in continuing to support people. And are there data points has that data point been tracked and measured that there's a significant increase in engagement or interest in engagement even?
So we did a literature review on cash transfer and cash policies. So, there isn't a lot around guaranteed income because we haven't had one, right? But we can look at earned income tax credit and other things to extrapolate out what happens when people have additional cash. And one of the sections was on civic engagement that we looked at. And that is as far as my memory goes on this. So again, I will follow up with what information we do have. I think that is a question that the folks at MGI might be exploring in some of the demonstrations. And I think some of the other demonstrations that are not related to MGI and not with the Center for Guaranteed Income Research are also thinking about civic engagement. I think it is part of the In Her Hands program down in Georgia. Again, so I've talked about this briefly, that was launched through the Old Fourth Ward Economic Security Task Force, thinking about the Black women in particular being pushed out of the neighborhood. And so how guaranteed income can keep those women in the neighborhood that they've built that makes it a desirable place to live. And I believe that civic engagement is really part of how they were thinking about this, because it is those women that have created that neighborhood, that sustain that neighborhood, that are the backbone of that neighborhood. And so how a guaranteed income can ensure that they are that they're able to maintain that. So I think folks are looking at it and thinking about it. Amaya Pawar, who was an alderman in Chicago and part of the Chicago task force, thinks a lot about civic engagement and has, I think, transitioned then to really thinking about public banking and the need for that, and how that also ties into guaranteed income, creates pipelines for that. And then we worked with Naomi Zodi and Derek Hamilton and a few other folks on a guaranteed income for the 21st century that calls for using the tax code to create a negative income tax specifically for the inclusionary aspects of that and the robust civic engagement, where if the tax code is not there to keep people out, but instead to call people in, what does that mean?
And then I have kind of a second question. I hope I'm not taking up too much time, but it might be more of an observation. I feel like, the conversation at the beginning of the pandemic was all about $15 minimum wage is what we need. And I kind of feel like that's something I haven't heard in a while. And we're well past that. Is that something that you guys have also kind of seen, or does that?
I mean, SCIU is still working on a fight for 15, and we recognize that a $15 minimum wage is not a living wage in most cities. So it's hard because we haven't actually achieved it in a lot of places. The federal minimum wage hasn't moved in decades, and it's a great slogan, and we all know fight for 15. It's fight for 15 and a union, by the way. Let's not drop the end of it. Yeah. And also it's okay, well, now we're at 25, y'all. $25 an hour is where we need to be. So fight for 25 is maybe what we need to start saying.
Yeah, I feel like that's the kind of shift I've seen, that we're just talking about higher and higher numbers because it's just getting harder and harder. Thank you, guys.
So there was one more question from our virtual audience, and this one is from Fred Weber. And he wants to know about the gig economy. He asked, the gig economy has many problems, as we know. If we had a UBI and universal health care, are many/most of these ameliorated enough that the gig economy becomes a good/decent thing?
I was honestly kind of impressed with how much money I was able to make on Instacart. But again, it was not consistent. And so I think yes, but kind of answer. Like it depends on how much of a basic income people are getting. It depends on like how much of a that insurance is actually covering. So yeah, like how robust those things are certainly there's a relationship to that answer. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Janet Bauer, and I'm from Portland, and happy that you all are here. You probably know that we have a strong public sector labor movement, and it's really important. They're important partners. We have had in the income movement conversations with labor leaders, and they're very open and have given initial support to campaigns that we've envisioned. But I really would love to dig a little bit into their self-interest. And I'm struggling a little bit because, and particularly the self-interest of the rank and file. I think that the labor leaders understand this bigger picture, and particularly on how cash can improve the bargaining position of workers. But I'm not sure that that is instinctive for rank and file folks. And that is I don't know that that's so true for public sector workers. So I guess I just wonder what ideas that you have about sort of arguments on that kind of self-interest. Ideas that I have are, that it's an enhanced wage replacement to go on strike. But are there other things, and maybe you could say a little bit more about that idea if you think it's, valid. So some help for us in building our relationships with our labor partners would be really helpful.
Okay. So I love that you think that labor leaders are going to be the easy ones, because I actually see that. I love you so deeply, labor. I come out of labor. This is so close to my heart, and it really challenges, right? So Erica Smiley of Jobs of Justice is really fabulous, thinking about the trade-offs we made in this country post-World War II and how labor sold out Black and brown workers, and like sold that out for white workers, and in ways in which labor solidifies power by saying it is through us that you will get good health insurance. So we're not going to join the fight for universal health care. It is through us that you will get good wages. So we're not going to join the fight for, like a broader fight for guaranteed income. So that actually, I see that as more of the challenge, is how do we break that down and say, we need to have a robust, multiracial reckoning with what labor should and can do and who it needs to work for. So then when we think about rank and file, then that's just how do we talk to anybody about guaranteed income, right? And we say, well, if you have a guaranteed income, like, yeah, it totally acts as a strike fund. It allows other folks to coordinate, to build unions, even though that is protected activity. Folks are fired all the time for engaging in it, right? And also, think about what else your union could do for you if they didn't have to fight for your wages. What else do you want in your job, right? Like, so I was telling this story the first time I worked for a well-funded nonprofit and they had LaCroix in the office. I was like, what is this magic, right? So like, what else do we want? Somebody was saying that, like, what else do we want from our jobs, right? I don't want you to control my healthcare because like, I need to always have that. I don't want to have to be fighting for my wages at all times. Like, I want that already taken care of. And then I want us to think about, like, what decisions are we making that is making this a better planet? What decisions are we making that is building power for everyone? What decisions are we making to build safety throughout our structures? So that's how I think we get at rank and file. And And also LaCroix. I don't know. Like free seltzer is still a magic thing for me. So
Kind of a lovely note to end on. So I think I'm going to wrap up there. So number one, thank you all for attending and including how, I'm not sure where to look, but the live folks on the live stream, thank you all for being here as well.